Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well out there this week. I'm going to take just a few minutes and talk to you all about a theory known as attachment theory. It provides the foundation for a lot of the ideas that are conveyed in our grief textbook, and then also for a lot of the ideas that are in this week's chapter of our crisis and trauma textbook. Pardon me if I'm repeating myself. Attachment theory is an ethological theory of personality development, and that means that when I say ethological, it means it is originally based on observations of animal behavior and the way that animals behave in their natural environment. And taking those observations and applying them to human psychological development was actually a kind of a revolutionary idea, you can imagine. And the theory was developed by a psychoanalyst named John Bowlby, who lived in Victorian era England, or who was a child during Victoria era England. And during his childhood, he came to question the prevailing style of parenthood of the times. And that's where the parents are sort of cold, distant authority figures. He grew up in an upper class family, so a nanny did a lot of the kind of hands on parenting. He was then sent to boarding school, and these experiences led him to question whether or not that distant style of parenting, was the most healthful way to raise children. And furthermore, he started developing hypotheses that the way that children were raised, that their experiences in childhood significantly influenced the way that they functioned and developed relationships later in life. Now, to us, probably it's a little bit on the duh side. It seems fairly common sense. However, in Bowlby's times, it was not common sense, and in fact, it was almost viewed heretically by some. So he was a classically trained psychoanalyst, like Carl Jung, was in the sort of Freudian line of things, like Jung. Eventually was kind of cast out from that group, also like Jung. And he was the director of the prestigious child department at the Tavistock Research Clinic in London. And this is where he completed most of his important works. And maybe of greatest note, at least in terms of sort of getting him on the center stage of major developments in science, was a paper that he wrote for the World Health Organization, reporting on the effects of homelessness for the mental health of children in post-war Europe. And in this paper, Bowlby laid out a direct link between biology and attachment behavior in evolutionary terms. I'll explain that a little more explicitly in the slides. But I guess what I do want to hit home is that, again, it was definitely a departure from the orthodoxy of the day, and a somewhat radical idea. So kind of at the crux of attachment theory are attachment styles. And attachment styles are a series of enduring patterns of social interaction that are comprised of our relative level of social interest, self-efficacy, and empathy. And as I mentioned, Bowlby grounded his ideas for attachment style uh, in evolutionary in an evolutionary perspective, theorizing that the drive for close, caring relationships, and specifically between infants and caregivers, is essential for healthy psychological development and therefore has been selected by evolution. And when I say selected by evolution, I mean that, how do I say it? That therefore people with healthy attachments are going to be more likely to contribute to the gene pool. Evolution selects traits that are beneficial to the species, and according to Bowlby's theory, a strong, healthy drive for adaptive social relationships. And a little bit more specifically, what Bowlby theorized is that secure attachment is a necessary condition for healthful psychological adjustment. So the need to be close is rooted in evolution. That the need for warm, intimate, and loving relationships in which both caregivers and infants express enjoyment we're hardwired that way in order to contribute to the strength and preservation of the species. And Bowlby conceptualized the development of an individual's attachment style as being a developmental. So these would be stages that occur during infancy and early childhood. The first stage, attachment, is a stage of self-knowledge, just awareness of one's self, the infant's self, and trust in the infant's caregiver. Then from there, the next stage is developing a healthy sense of self separate from the caregiver, followed by a integration. So you have this, if you're an infant, you have this period where you realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm different from her, usually the mother. Then you have this sense that, oh, wait a minute, she's not always nice. Sometimes she's cranky. And you have this integration stage where you're able to reconcile that. Where, okay, even though the caregiver, usually the mother, is not perfect, on the whole, she's, a pretty good deal. That being a necessary developmental stage. And then power of integration is really just kind of an ongoing continuation of the third stage. So Bowlby theorized that that attachment, the relative health of a people's attachment, was predictive of the health of their relationships later in life. And you can see how that would make sense lining up with evolution, because if you are able to maintain healthy relationships, and let's say we're back in cave times, being able to have healthy relationships is going to help you survive. Therefore, more people who do have healthy relationships would survive, and that's evolution selecting that trait. And you can certainly think of it with babies too. If you're like out in cave days and there's a baby who does not have a real knack for connecting with the caregiver, and then there's, compared to say that baby's sibling that does have a real knack for connecting with the caregiver. And I know dinosaurs weren't around at the same time as people. Let's just pretend for a minute that dinosaur attack descends upon them. It's quite likely that the baby with the knack for developing the strong relationship is going to be the baby that survives, thereby contributing to the gene pool. Furthermore, and kind of out of the fantasy realm, adults who as children do not experience parenting that has these qualities of warmth and empathy and kind of mutually beneficial interaction, well, these adults are less likely to have important characteristics like self-reliance, empathy for others, interest in the broader society, and the ability to form intimate connections themselves. So really, at the very center of it, it's a simple idea. The quality of early relationships is predictive of individuals' social relational patterns across the lifespan. And these social relational patterns are basically stable. Essentially, you get what you get. You have your developmental stages, develop your attachment identity, and it's not something that's going to change a whole lot throughout the rest of your life. And so the idea of attachment styles, specific attachment styles or profiles, actually came out of research not done by Bowlby, but done by a woman named Mary Ainsworth, who did observational studies with infants and their mothers across a range of settings. I think she did some in Africa, in really remote communities in Africa, and this is going back some time as well, so easier to find remote communities there. And then typical American communities, and she observed patterns that were common irrespective of where she was in the world. So these infants and mothers in a remote community in Africa had basically the same series of patterns in their relationships as infants and mothers who were studied in a suburb in Baltimore. And those relational patterns actually broke out into distinct patterns. Among the infants, you saw what Ainsworth labeled as secure attachment, and that's an infant that is content with the caregiver and very kind of explorative to the environment where they are. The infant is anxious when a stranger enters the picture, but can be calmed by the caregiver. And this pattern, the secure pattern in infants, is a result, or at least associated with, a healthy relationship with the parent. A separate pattern called anxious avoidant in infants is where the infant is kind of standoffish from their caregiver and are not very explorative. They don't get nervous when there's a stranger and they don't really have much emotional reaction when the caregiver leaves or when the caregiver returns. And this is associated with infant care that did not provide appropriate support for emotional regulation. So we could think of this as an infant who has learned through their interaction that overt attempts at affection on their part, on the infant's part, are not returned in kind. So that the child develops a strategy whereby they don't reach out kind of obviously for attention because they've come to understand that it's not going to be returned, that it's not the best strategy for staying near their caregiver. Then there's anxious resistant, and again this is an infant attachment style where the infant engages in a little exploration like the other maladaptive style, but is very distressed when the caregiver departs. Nevertheless, if the caregiver departs and the infant freaks out, very stressed out, when the caregiver returns, the infant is not able to be soothed very easily. And this pattern was associated with inconsistent care. Sometimes the caregiver's there, sometimes the caregiver's flaking out. So the infant doesn't have a real strong sense of kind of a predictable environment. And then there's disorganized, disoriented. Sometimes they call this style also fearful avoidant, and it's basically a really pathological attachment style. So for children who are raised in the kind of the worst of war-torn conditions and maybe lose a parent or are subjected to some kind of horrible abuse as a child, they will develop a pattern of attachment that's kind of undirected and dysregulated. It's a very small portion of as a percentage, it's a very small group. So those four styles correspond to attachment styles in adulthood. And in adulthood, the corresponding styles are anxious, avoidant, secure, and disorganized. And again, disorganized we won't talk about too much more. It's a representative of very severe pathology and kind of a different discussion from just how does attachment theory work. So these adult styles, as you'll see on the next slide, differ slightly from the profiles in infancy, but they're kind of what those infant profiles grow into as adults. So this, theoretically, this would be sort of how you and I would be representing our attachment in adulthood. Secure attachment, no surprise, is going to reflect a positive view of self and others and relationships with them. A good balance of being able to be close with people without being over-dependent, with being able to depend on others when we need to, and also function autonomously. Basically, overall healthy adjustment. Avoidant attachment would be a real discomfort with intimacy, a sense that relationships are unimportant, and a negative view of both other people and relationships. The prevailing idea would be that the reason for this is that really on a deeper level, a person with a strong avoidant type is just concerned and afraid that to reach out for intimacy would result in being rebuked or rejected. And then there's the anxious attachment style, and this is folks who seek high levels of approval. We'd say codependent is, I think they even had codependent personality disorder in the DSM a couple versions back. And it's that type of deal. High levels of intimacy, really concerned about are other people valuing me enough, really dependent on external praise, and a real tendency towards low self-esteem. A little bit of a side point, but currently, actually, full disclosure, attachment is my primary area of research. So when there's an opportunity for me to get to bring it into our courses, I do. But back to my point, a side issue is that generally today, for the most part, these are all considered dimensional categories or dimensional factors. So you or I or whoever would each have a level of secure, a level of avoidant, and a level of anxious, as opposed to it being like a typology where you either are secure, avoidant, or anxious. So again, what is at the core of that is that close caring relationships between infant and caregiver is key for healthy development. The early relationships predict the way that we interact with others and the world throughout life. And it's well supported by empirically, through scientific observation and study, and grounded in evolutionary theory. Again, just to really hit it home, the quality of early caregiver-infant relationships is predictive of stable, meaning you have them for your whole life, social relational attachment patterns across the lifespan. So, why am I talking about this? Well, it turns out that there's two reasons, I think, probably. The first is, I think, very obvious, but maybe a little bit more abstract. It certainly makes sense that the way that we have viewed our social connection to people throughout our life is going to dictate to large degree the way that we're able to accept and work with their loss. So what Bowlby's theory brings to grief is a lifespan developmental framework for thinking about the grieving process. Maybe more specifically, and perhaps more or equally as importantly, I don't think more importantly, but perhaps equally as importantly, attachment also predicts a whole slew of other outcomes. The relative health of someone's attachment tells us with how much health people are going to adapt to all kinds of situations. I just finished a study where we found that attachment actually predicted employment for people with spinal cord injury. Attachment is related to the way people experience a disability subjectively, in terms of, is this a kind of a cross for me to bear, or are folks able to adapt more readily? The way people experience pain can actually be predicted by attachment. These are all rehab outcomes, obviously. Mental health, pretty clearly predicted by attachment as well. So in line with that, coping and resilience, along with adaptation to loss and grieving, are related to attachment. So in the broad sense, why am I talking about this? It's because attachment provides the primary framework through which our textbooks look at the process of loss and the way that people adapt to loss. Thanks for your time, you all. I know I went a little longer than my customary 18 minutes. I appreciate your attention, and take care.